It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Wilson, our supervisor, your supervisor. I'm actually in the first district. Mike and I, believe it or not, have known each other just shy of 40 years. We started out as children. In Southern Humboldt. And Mike came to Humboldt State, is a registered engineer, professional engineer. I'm a registered amateur engineer. And started his political career as an elected official as a commissioner of the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation and Conservation District. That being so long of a name and hard to remember, he decided to run for Humboldt County Board of Supervisors, which is much easier to remember. He was elected 4 years ago and is now heading into a tough, unopposed re-election, which apparently means people are relatively satisfied with the job he's done so far. So he's going to give us a little update on what's going on with the County of Humboldt and give him a warm welcome.
Hello, good morning. I'm here because Carol Vandermeer texted me 2 days ago and said I need to be here. I'm just coming off of a slight vacation, so I don't have any presentation per se, so I'm just going to talk about what's going on in the county a little bit. And then I see a lot of new faces for me anyway, so I just want to introduce myself as well and sort of what is county government in general, and make Greg get water for me. That's true. But I also want to say thanks to everybody for doing all the work you do. Thanks, Greg, and thanks, AJ. This is great. Thank you for starting your business and getting it going, or kind of restarting it, Pilates. I was a Pilates person for just a short while when I was getting my hip redone. And I found that every time I go there and there would be a new instructor, they'd say, "What are you doing here?" Right? Because why is there a guy in this place? Kind of a funny thing that always happened to me. And I have to say, with the movie The Big Chill, I don't know, there's many people who were here that they weren't even born when it came out. And at that time, it was considered nostalgic. So I don't know, maybe it's like anthropological now. So I was raised here in Humboldt County in Southern Humboldt with Greg. We went to school together down there in high school. I did come to Humboldt State for a couple of years, but found that my rock and roll lifestyle was just not combining well with my school being at that time. So I moved away to San Francisco, as if that was less rock and roll at the time, and went to school there for engineering, civil engineering, where I got my degree. From there, I worked for some international firms, mostly in the Pacific area, both in as far away as Guam and as Arizona on the other side, mostly doing environmental cleanups for military bases and for refineries and those sorts of things. Kind of got tired of that, did a year-long stint of kind of a walkabout, I guess you'd call it, and traveled from Asia to Europe overland around 91, which was phenomenally dangerous, although I didn't realize it at the time. I looked back on it and think I survived, which is amazing. Came back to the Bay Area, realized I really loved Humboldt County, the place I grew up in, and came back here to do graduate school at Humboldt State in the environmental engineering environmental systems engineering program, where I studied basically at the Arcade Marsh and did my graduate studies there and in natural systems. And then from there, worked for the county for a little bit, but mostly from that point on, worked with my life partner, Laura, mostly doing engineering projects for tribes and for municipalities, kind of landscape level engineering and planning work. I was elected in 2005 to do the Harbor District for that amount of time. And then, as Greg said, I was elected 4 years ago to do supervisor stuff. So that has been a great adventure. What kind of pushed me into doing the supervisor work is that the community development work I was doing as elected for the Harbor District was a lot of fun and distracting to my everyday job, which was doing engineering work, and it just drew me into that path, and I enjoy this position quite a bit. It pays less for more hours, but quite honestly, and on a personal level, the freedom of not doing invoicing and all of those other things that sort of like keep that all together is a fair trade-off for me. And this is a job that's quite varied, and it's what we do, and so it's fun. I'm going to talk about that just right now. So I represent what is the 3rd district. You can see a little map right there. It's mostly Arcata. Really is like 80% of the population, more or less, but it includes Manila, and it includes Blue Lake, which is the center of the universe, according to some folks, and it includes Neelan, and it really has a corner, goes all the way down. You can see it's just almost touching Fortuna. So, haha. I have some corner of the Headwaters Forest in there as well, but that's the district. Mostly county government people don't. I mean, to be quite honest, like most people, it's sort of invisible in terms of like what they understand in terms of governance, because most people can understand what a city council person is and a mayor. There's things they hear about quite often, but supervisors is really less so in that. But mostly what we do is govern the jurisdictionally the county, of which there's 58 counties in the state of California. Most of them have 5 supervisors, except for just a few, which have maybe more if they're a city county. And it's really just an arm of the state, to be quite, to kind of put it where it's as most visceral, I suppose, because really most of the budget that the counties manage is state mandated funding related to state programs for social services, right? That is that's like kind of the biggest hunk of money that really that we have. And I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but our budget's $400 million a year. We have a balanced budget every year. This year we do. And a good chunk of that is that. Now, another big chunk of that money in what we manage has to do with public works. And again, this is all outside of cities. So sometimes people will call me and say, like, hey, I have a pothole in front of my house, or whatever that is. And I ask, where do you live? And not uncommon. They say, I live at, on Buttermilk Lane, or someplace that's in the city, and I have to refer them to the city council members that are here, and Brett and others, to deal with stuff. And sometimes there's things on the border and stuff like that. So those are kind of the main chunks of where we govern. And then basically land use decisions, how we manage land use, again, outside the cities, like what's the zoning of certain things? What are the land use impacts of everything from environmental issues to social issues to gun ordinances to all the way to water quality or whatever that may be. So we have those issues too. And then we intersect a lot with other elected bodies, which is like the sheriff and the DA. We mostly just manage budgets associated with those agencies because they're separately elected offices. And so we have relationships with them, and we can encourage them to take on policies or do certain things in certain ways. But in essence, we have to work with them as equals as opposed to, we don't oversee their departments in that way. So that's something that I want to make sure is clarified with people. In my job, it's kind of 3 parts. One is customer service. So just basically, I get calls for people who are just dissatisfied with things or want things to happen within the county and helping them do that. A lot of that has to do with potholes, to be quite honest, and roads are very important thing. And I want to point out also in that regard, like I have to remind people that we can fix potholes and put it on the list and do those sorts of things. And we're $200 million behind in terms of maintenance of roads in Humboldt County because roads as a technology are a relatively new thing, but they most of the roads in the county were developed under basically for wagons and horses and those sorts of things. And the geometry and the substrates of them are just old and terrible. And really the amount of money that is required to manage that is not being brought in by the taxes of a very few people that actually live in this county, which is quite remote, because we're almost the size of Connecticut. We're 2 hours driving across in each direction. This is a big county, and 130,000 people, most of which live in towns. And so the amount of money to manage these rural roads is we're way behind, as one might expect. But we're working on it. But I also remind people, the week after we fix potholes on any road, I get phone calls asking for speed bumps. Every time. Every time. I said, you had them. They were just inverted, right? Now here we go. There's one more. So that's sort of public, that part. And then there's the advocacy. So I advocate for this district on a board of 5, and as you may know, we have meetings and things that don't have straight across unanimous votes, although most of them are, just like in the city council and anywhere else. There's a lot of pedestrian things we do where it's all mostly worked out and we can vote and move on. But there's a reason why we have 5 people, is because there's disagreement. We have to work those things out. And then a lot of what I do is basically advocating at the state and national level for laws and policies that are beneficial to our district, and especially in the return of assets. And I tell people oftentimes that we concentrate on elections, national elections, as if they are the most important thing. And as you know, your feeds come in on your social media and everywhere else. It's probably 95% or more what the president is doing, or maybe what your state level people are doing. But really, in your electoral processes, you have to vote for the team that basically receives and manages those assets as they come back that you pay in your taxes. You pay them out, right? But you got to get your team together to actually harvest that back in and redistribute it and manage it for all of the things that are around you. And I would say that even just if you just look out this window, the construct of your everyday life was basically a series of decisions that were made locally by people who were elected locally, right? And so, and just from your water to your sewer to your sidewalk to your parks, everything that you, when you walk down the street, or every construct that you have that's around you, were made by local decisions, not as much so much by national decisions, right? So your local vote matters more than anything, and your involvement in local politics is actually fundamentally far more of an efficient way to extract value from your political, exercise that you do. So I highly encourage people to do that. So that's kind of the overall. This is like the speech I give to like high school kids, right, for the most part. At this level, I know there's supposed to be like 5 minutes for questions, but I just want to cut it. I'll just let you know this next year, mostly, again, we're like every government. Most of our time is just keeping the gears of the social fabric of society held together. And so it's it's budgets, it's our public works, it's our social services, and all those things are kind of grinding on forward. We have issues of homelessness, we have issues of environment. Those are all moving forward. So I think probably in this next year for the county, we're going to be introducing a plan to start to, has anyone, I'm going to ask this question, everyone has at some point or another probably dealt with county services in one way or another. And we have offices all over the place, and it's pretty inefficient, and they're in old buildings if we own them, and we're paying a lot of rent if we don't, and we have ADA issues all over the place. And so we're trying to think about how we can consolidate a lot of those services in a campus format in downtown, in Eureka. So we're going to really be talking about that strategy, because there's a lot of efficiency in that. there's not just a lot of efficiency from an energy perspective, there's a, customer service, servicing everybody to make sure that they're to help them co-locate a lot of our services, who aren't running around all over the place. But also we need new facilities to recruit and retain employees. And we've seen that all over the place here in Humboldt County, where our larger organizations, especially healthcare organizations, really understand that a lot. We're seeing a lot of new healthcare investments in terms of with open door clinics, and having one here in Arcata and Fortuna and other places. But a lot of these organizations are investing in the infrastructure to just maintain their employees, not just their services. So that's going to be, and then also we will be getting into our climate action plan. We'll have a draft of that coming out as well, and hopefully we'll be able to take a lot more action on that as well. So those are kind of two things we're going to be really hitting in stride, I hope, coming up in the next year. But now I'm just ready for questions. That was too fast. No, just kidding. Go ahead. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, relationship of the supervisors and the county, as you see it, with PG&E, and what's going on with all of that, what the state is doing with them, and the other utilities, and so on and so forth.
Well, in terms of like our relationship directly with PG&E, I mean, we have, I would say, relationships with them on a working level. They have of course, they have their own internal chaos occurring right now with the bankruptcy and those other things. And within that, there may be some opportunities to help things get better in terms of the infrastructure. And we've seen, we went through this disastrous shutdown this last year. And part of one of those things was, the big surprise to everybody was our local power plant, our natural gas-fired power plant. We can talk about that in a minute, because we just chose that over wind. But that natural gas-fired power plant, we thought was ready to service us in terms of this shutdown, but it wasn't. It was a surprise to everybody. I mean, it was a surprise to people within PG&E, and I will put that on them a bit, but really they had a big transition that occurred when they went from their diesel powered or their plant to this natural gas, and basically someone siloed that and they got that all done, but it was just assumed that this was all going to be connected, and it wasn't just physically, it was also within their institutional. So the people with the institutional memory on how to like reconnect and redo all that stuff, they had moved on, and no one had really, there had not been a test of that system. So I will say that more than likely that is not going to happen again. We've been assured over and over that they're working on getting that all put back together, and I can't speak for them, because I don't know the details of what it is, but they're guaranteeing to us that they're getting past that. It's just a technological and an institutional issue they got to deal with, and so hopefully that's not going to happen again. Yeah.
I appreciate the idea of infrastructure and maintaining your buildings and consolidating, but one of the reasons that some services are spread out is for access for people, and Open Door is also very spread out for access. So if you take all the services that people need and put them in Eureka, you're going to create problems for people with disabilities and people who don't drive. And I mean, the reason that the county did this years ago was very much to make services more accessible in communities. So,
well, this isn't, I'm not talking about things in communities per se. Like our planning department, right, is in an old hospital, which is not accessible. I mean, it's terrible for 80.
Right.
That's an example.
So you're not talking about the services that you currently have in the different communities?
No, it's not talking about taking all our libraries and putting them into our library or anything like that. No, we're talking about services that are basically in and around the city of Eureka already that are just
in bad shape.
They're in bad shape and they're kind of all over the place, yeah.
And then my other question was, what is the county doing and looking at in terms of housing? Because I know that different cities are looking at housing and how to develop housing. I just
Yep.
wonder how the county is addressing that, because you have the lion's share of property. I mean, it's in county, not you, but it's in the county area.
Right, that's a good question. So especially when we're addressing climate issues, right? Because really, the bulk of our climate impact comes from transportation, and that transportation is directly related to where we work versus where we live, right? And so even though the county has the bulk of the land per se, the developable land in terms of its connection to utilities and all those things really lie within the city jurisdictions. And we really should be working more with cities to densify rather than create more sprawl, because in the end, we create more sprawl, all we do is create more traffic issues in the cities. We are really learning very quickly now the long-term sustainability of the single-family dwelling, and that development pattern is not sustainable, at least not under, and I'm going to say it this way, like in terms of like our Prop 13 and those sorts of things, because the long-term generation of tax revenues that come from that don't really pay for, which is why we're behind on our roads, which is why we're behind on getting social services out into rural areas. It's just not, it's not really that sustainable. And we're even seeing in folks that are young people who are trying to buy houses in some of the older neighborhoods, that the houses themselves aren't maintained to the level that they can actually get loans, right? Because the model by which people in the past were developing housing, you know, people are now having to have two incomes to maintain a house, and it's becoming harder and harder to do that, and it's just that we're having a hard time. So we are definitely looking for locations where we can have more housing, but it's really got to be in areas where we have those services. So like McKinleyville is a good example. But even in outside Eureka, we are having problems with asking for development fees. Humboldt County is the only county in the state of California, I think, that doesn't have any development fees, right? And so we have no way to basically bolster infrastructure with relationship to that. So it's a challenge.
The county was all set to buy a chunk of property there in Eureka, not far, from where the vacant parking lot is for parking.
Yeah.
And it seemed like once a little resistance showed up, it just dropped it like it wasn't a big deal. And is there an alternative? I mean, you can't build something on the dirt, on the gravel lot unless you have a place to displace that parking. Is there a plan in place you had a plan to buy that city block and make parking. It just kind of went away without comment. It seemed like in the newspapers at least.
Yeah, and that piece of property we were looking at wasn't for parking. That was just a temporary use of the site because we couldn't own substandard housing. We just can't do it. And so that we were looking at that property for this campus project that I'm talking about. So really, it's really that was kind of the long-term vision of that piece of property, which maybe you're familiar with. It's right across the street from the courthouse. There was a lot of controversy because the county, and if we were to own that piece of property, we really would have to tear down the substandard housing because we're under an ADA consent decree from the federal government right now, which basically says you can't move in any direction unless it's ADA compliant, and everything that's not ADA compliant, which is a lot of things in Humboldt County, has to come up to code. So that's really what happened there. And so what would have been a temporary parking facility to help manage for this issue of the development on the gravel parking lot, which many people have seen, the gravel parking lot next to the county building. And why is it gravel? Well, because there's no point in upgrading it because there will be a structure built there. Basically, it's part of an expansion to our jail services there, and it's not a place necessarily to house more people in jail. It's really a transitional facility for probation and getting basically the services and more of those services that are out and about, getting those co-located, those social services for people in transition out of our correctional system. So that's what's going to go there. and we have to find parking, and I think probably what we'll be doing is, what we're really trying hard to do is work out a deal with the parking lot across the street that the state owns, which you see lots of vacancy in, and that's really what we need to do. And to be quite honest, we looked at parking around the area, and yeah, I mean, we could, there is a lot of parking around there. It's just that we, as humans, don't like to walk more than a block to get someplace, and we tend to, you know, get concerned about that, especially when it's raining. So we're working on that. But again, we really need to work on getting development into Eureka or Arcata, and worry a little bit less about parking. And I know it's an issue here in Arcata a bit, but I have to understand, we used to have parking requirements in downtown Arcata, right, for development, and that created blight. Because what happened was we just had a bunch of vacant lots. And you remember 10 years ago, before the city of Arcata changed that policy, we had a vacant lot there, we had a vacant lot over there. This is 15 years ago. We had vacant lots all over the place because the cost of developing parking was basically causing it, you know, development to not happen at all. And so we just had gravel lots. And so, you know, now we have more buildings and more commerce in downtown Arcata because we lifted those parking requirements. So I'm really going off into all kinds of directions. Yeah.
Well, I live on a narrow county-maintained road in the
Yes.
3rd District, and has a lot of potholes, and the you know, brush grows on it. And I want to compliment the county, because every year they bring the hot mix up and they fill the holes and they trim back the trees. And I know that I can appreciate the difficulty of maintaining, I don't know how many hundreds of miles of roads, and that they do that every year. So I want to thank the county for doing that.
I have an easier district than others. Well, thank you for that, thank you. But, you know, I mean, this isn't the road to Petrolia, right? You know, in general, I mean, we have some funky roads. They get funkier as you get out to like Neeland in terms of the 3rd District. But overall, you know, we have most of the population lives within fairly close, within 10 miles of these core, you know, dense population densities. So it was a little easier to placate the, you know, to get to those places. But the farther out you go, the more difficult it really gets, and the more expensive. And then you look at like even like the road up to Neeland. I mean, that road is developed for the, you know, was developed for literally horses and wagons, you know. And so again, the geometry, the substrate, everything about it is not built like a road. It should be built. And yet, you know, the expectation of people in the current context, in their current sphere, they expect it to be like a real road and have all the things that you might want to have on that. And the other thing that we're seeing, the change that we're seeing in terms of roads, is the vehicles themselves as a technology have changed so dramatically, even in the last 15 years. So a big truck, like when I was a kid, I grew up in Southern Humboldt, and we didn't have 4-wheel drive so much as a young person. We had, like, maybe some people had the
Volkswagens
Toyotas.
were back.
Yeah, or whatever. I had a Nova station wagon or something. It went everywhere, right? And we kind of lived in that context. And a lot of these streets that go down, just as an example, out in Freshwater, you know, the road goes right through the middle of their community, and it has forever, you know, since the road was built. And the technology of a vehicle, of a large truck now, with its, you know, microprocessors and its precise engineering, make a thing that is the size of a tank, because we created 12-foot lanes in the 1950s so that we could move tanks across the United States. That's where that standard came from, which is why American cars are so big. We built our cars into that space. Now we built the technology to drive them at 75 miles an hour, the size of a tank, during curvy roads. And now they're going through the middle of communities, right? And that is making people feel very unsafe around that technology. So that is something we're trying to engineer around and try and deal with. And that's part of one of the reasons why we did the, you know, the speed tables through there, is because it was just getting out of control. People were feeling extremely unsafe, and they were, and people were getting, you know, injured. And so that's part of what we're dealing with, is was that change in technology and on these roads. So I hope will that help you? All right, what else we got? Anyone else? Any question or a comment or criticism or?
Well, you got away too cheap so far because we didn't make you talk about the wind project. Is there any high ridge in Humboldt County that the tribe won't pull a trump card out and say you can't build it there? I mean, is it that simple? Should people just forget about it? Or are there possibilities?
Well, I mean, okay, anyone who followed that episode knows that I kind of went through an existential crisis during the middle of that, because we're not right at the end, really, to be quite honest. So I think there was a lot of problems that we had with that whole issue. Part of it was just a tsunami of, you're filming me, and I'm just going to say it, a tsunami of bullshit that was just covered that project in so many different ways, and I would say mostly from a negative perspective. And I would say that the misinformation that was just put out there there was never a backfill to that. And I think part of that is culturally, people have a hard time speaking up related to things that if it involves a corporation or something that's big or whatever that is. I think part of the problem that we had with this project is that we have a tendency, and I'm in there too, something looks kind of big, I'm going to think of it a little bit negative. That's why I live in Humboldt County. I don't want big, ugly, whatever that might be. But the problem is we have a confirmation bias problem. And so we consume information that feeds into that bias. And we tend to believe, even if it's not true, those things that, in terms of that. We also have a problem with not understanding that the status quo is not a neutral position, right? Especially as we talk about climate change and energy. So the status quo, not choosing that project, the project choosing, not choosing that project, not choosing that project is actually, in essence, choosing something else. We didn't really frame it that way, and it really didn't hit me that way until very late in the game, which is we chose fracked natural gas for our lights, right? Half of our energy comes from a natural gas plant on Humboldt Bay that sits at 12-foot elevation, by the way, and that's the choice, right, that was being presented was wind energy or fracked natural gas. And we never really talked about fracked natural gas as one of our choices. We just talked about wind energy, wind energy, wind energy, wind energy, and I think we had a big problem with that. But then going back to sort of the tribal issue, we definitely were not prepared for that. So when you ask the question and you frame it in a way, it's like, well, what's going to happen next? Well, what happens next is we got to do some more work. And sitting down, and I met with yesterday, before these days are kind of blending together, with tribal representatives of the Wiyot tribe to talk about what is the way forward on virtually everything else as we do this. And I think we just really need to be more proactive in that. We really lost track of something that at the landscape level we didn't really understand, and we left it to, as leaders, to a private company to deal with it, and in the end it just came crashing down right at the, there was no way to negotiate our way through that in a meeting in the public, in that space, in that way.
So
It's just not going to happen.
it kind of got too far before it was completely known that those issues need to be addressed more specifically and more directly.
Yeah.
I mean, the tribes don't have a problem putting ugly stuff on their property. They build casinos all the time, so maybe if you build a wind farm where you want it to get paid for it, it would work.
I
But
don't speak for tribes, and I don't think anyone really should except for themselves. And what I do know is that, the tribal entities are diverse, and they all don't speak for each other, and they all don't represent each other. And especially at the landscape level, that's just not the way that it works. And so, I mean, and part of the problem too is, non-tribal community often leverages what they believe to be tribal interests for their own sake. And you see that a lot, and I saw, you know, I sit on the coastal commission, we didn't talk about that, thank goodness. But I've only been there, you know, it's 6 months, and in my first meeting, right, where it was a tribal project, it was the hotel on Trinidad Harbor. And so I will have the same people telling me at that moment, like, you know, we've got to stop this, blah, 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 blah. And then, you know, 6 months later, stand with the wheel of tribe, right? He's like, we have to be more consistent and understanding about what that means and be, you know, better advocates for sort of the broader issues, I think.
So can there be a plan? I mean,
Yeah.
can the county work on identifying places, saying, anybody have a problem with this? Map out locations that are gonna work for everybody,
You can.
that's willing to speak up,
Yeah.
and then go out to the corporations and say, this is what we have available.
It's not, I mean, the law is, you know, the county and the developer follow the law. So the construct of that is very simple and easy. The problem is that it doesn't matter in the court of public opinion whether you follow that or not in this context. So you can have the righteousness of be feeling that way, that I follow the law and all those things. But in the end, when I'm sitting there looking at this event that is unfolding in front of me and thinking, okay, I've got a future Standing Rock heading our way. I got the, you know, what just happened in Hawaii, right, with the telescope. If that's the direction that we're going to go in terms of a project, it doesn't matter what the law says, but going back to, can we do better at planning? Yes, we can do better at planning this. We really need to pull a positive response from what just occurred. I certainly do. I have to tell you, it took me, I'm still not fully recovered. I haven't shaved since then. You know, from what was, I believe, a sort of existential problem, because it's like we're being asked to decolonize, right, in terms of the common vernacular, and decarbonize. And how do we do that? You know, we're trying to survive on this planet and, you know, and come out on positively with our neighbors, and it is a very difficult thing to do. I'm hoping that we take some lessons from this and can move forward positively.
But-
we got work.
But we also elected you to make hard decisions.
Yes.
And sort out it's bad because of corporations. Nobody's gonna build a wind farm that isn't gonna make money.
Well, and
So there are elements that
And
you need to decide to ignore
I
because they're
get that,
bogus.
and what I'm saying is like, what I don't think people understood is like the other choice was the corporations that frack that we now support with our lights, right? So we didn't really do a good job of balancing those things, and I apologize, AJ, for taking.
I just want you to remember that sometimes the public can be wrong.
They can. They can be, and that wasn't really the point. It's like, what is the direct, I mean,
Sure.
overall, like, is that fight for this particular project gonna be good for this community, or even wind energy in general? And so that's kind of where we really, I mean, that's where I had to like, really, and do I think I made the right decision? I really don't know. To be quite honest, I mean, I'm still grappling with that, and this was a tough one. That's all I have for you. Oh, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Mike, for coming today and to our program.
Thank you for having me, everybody.
You have one last thing? Okay, so Rob,
And you can sign me up for 9 a.m.
yeah, got it.
Okay, that's.